9, 8.
Our first steps into space were leaps into the unknown. We knew little of what lay beyond the blue.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
Despite some breathtaking success, outer space is still the most hostile place ever known.
Houston, we've had a problem.
But we may have to tame space in order to save ourselves.
There is 100% certainty that at some future time, this planet will be uninhabitable.
Another planet may be our only option.
The human race has a choice. It can either sit here till it becomes the next great extinction, or we preserve the race elsewhere.
This may seem like the stuff of science fiction, but NASA teams are busy working to make it a reality. Just one big hurdle remains.
The fragileness of the human body is something that we take with us when we go into deep space.
The question now is whether human ingenuity can overcome the human body's limitations. NASA has an epic new challenge.
By the mid-2030s, I believe we can send humans to orbit Mars and return them safely to Earth. And a landing on Mars will follow. And I expect to be around to see it.
A trip to Mars is no easy feat. It's a 34 million mile odyssey through an environment that would kill a human in less than a minute.
The reality is we can build the technologies that we need to go other places, but the human body itself is the most fragile of any of these technologies.
Space is an infinite vacuum with fatally low atmospheric pressure and lethal radiation levels. It supports no forms of life that we know of. A trip to Mars will be the riskiest journey we've ever attempted.
When President Kennedy issued his challenge to go to the moon, we'd never been to orbit. And 9 years later, we were on the surface of the moon. Risk is the price of progress.
Reaching the moon 250,000 miles away was an epic achievement. But Mars is more than 100 times farther. We'll need some huge technological leaps to get there. The crew must endure 3 years of microgravity and its impact on the body, radiation sickness, muscle and bone loss. They will face a punishing entry through the Martian atmosphere to then land on a dusty, stormy planet. Here, they must eke out an existence, and that will require the ability to function well in a topsy-turvy world of microgravity. Conquering weightlessness is a primary survival skill.
You have to learn how to move your body to get it in the right spot. For example, we want to put a bolt into a nut. Well, if you turn this drill, because you're not in gravity and your feet aren't on the ground, you'd spin around more than the bolt would.
Our first attempts to do even simple things in space posed unexpected challenges.
Liftoff. We have a roll program initiated.
In 1965, NASA chose Ed White to make history. As Gemini 4 orbited Earth, he waited for the command to let go.
Well, the object was to go outside and come back in and not kill anybody while we're doing it.
Okay, I'm separating from the spacecraft.
He floated out and floated around on the end of his tether.
Okay, I'm out.
America's first spacewalk was an utter leap of faith that the tether would hold, that the oxygen supply would function properly, and that every single element of his spacesuit, every layer, every seal, would keep White alive. If it failed, he'd lose consciousness in 15 seconds. Within a minute, the atmospheric pressure would boil his blood.
Gemini suits were really that first foray in designing a suit that purposely functioned outside a spacecraft. They were designed to protect against radiation and also great fluctuations in temperature.
All of that essential protection added up to some 34 pounds of bulky and restrictive layers.
The Gemini spacesuit, when it was inflated, it was in one position. To move your arm or anything, you had to bend this knit tube that your arm or leg was in.
I'm coming back down on the spacecraft.
For 20 exhilarating minutes in 1965, Ed White's suit did its job.
It looks beautiful. I feel like $1 million.
NASA thought they'd cracked the art of spacewalking.
We came to the conclusion that spacewalking was a very natural process. The crew adapted very easily and very well.
But astronauts needed to work in space, not just float in it. So NASA gave the next Gemini spacewalkers simple jobs to push the envelope. And space, quite literally, pushed back.
During Gene Cernan's spacewalk, he was overcompensating for his movements. He thrashed around in the weightless environment, couldn't get to where he needed to get, and came close to passing out.
Over the next 18 months, 2 more astronauts struggled and failed.
Every time someone got out, they seemed to fight the outside, and every time they went to the spacecraft, it seemed to repel them. And finally, we all forgot Newton's third law of motion. To every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction.
What NASA failed to realize was that if an astronaut touches anything in space, it will push him in the opposite direction. The solution was to train underwater, and rookie astronaut Buzz Aldrin took the plunge.
We had Buzz Aldrin put on a spacesuit, and we put weights around his waist to make him neutrally buoyant. And then we built a series of footholds and handholds on the mock-up, and he then tried to see how he could work comfortably outside the spacecraft.
November 11, 1966. Aldrin makes a last-ditch effort on Gemini 12. It's the final Gemini mission, and the pressure is on. No successful spacewalk, no moonwalk by the end of the decade. But with hours of neutral buoyancy training behind him, Aldrin makes it look easy.
It was a kind of simple-minded monkey, do this and screw this. Spacewalking is something that should be done slow, gradual, with just the slightest movements and pressures. It was a bunch of little tasks, but they were all so simple that everything got done.
Buzz triumphed. The spacewalking hurdle was jumped. Every astronaut since trains maneuvers in space in NASA's giant swimming pool, the Neutral Buoyancy Lab.
We've had an excellent run here. We simulated a spacewalk that we hadn't done before, and we're going to send up what we learned today to the crew who's in orbit so they can go outside in just a week or two to fix the space station.
Mike Fink is one of 200 men and women who have since stepped out into the inky void.
You can prepare to a certain degree, but there's nothing like that first feeling that you have when all of a sudden you're weightless, your body starts shifting. All the fluids inside that are normally down in your legs want to go up higher, your face feels puffy, and yet you're exhilarated in your heart because you're out in space and you look down at planet Earth, and it's also exciting.
Over 5 decades, astronauts working in space have accomplished amazing missions. Everything from the awe-inspiring repair of the Hubble telescope to building the colossal International Space Station. A 9-month journey to Mars is a real leap into the unknown. Our bodies just aren't built to live, much less work, in this incredibly unforgiving environment. no one knows what will happen to people up there that long. In 1973, NASA set out to discover the impact of long-term space missions on the human body.
They were afraid if someone stayed in space too long, they might not come back in good enough shape to survive.
First, NASA needed to give the astronauts more space to live in, so they built Skylab, the first space station, using the shell of an old Saturn V rocket.
An upper stage of Saturn V was converted into very, very spacious living quarters, at least by space standards.
The first crew, named Skylab 2, launched on May 25, 1973. The astronauts spend 28 days in space, doubling NASA's previous record. Skylab 3 orbited for 59 days. And on November 16, 1973, Skylab 4 finally approached the space station. Their mission to last over 80 days inside.
It was about the size of a 3-bedroom home, but we were working in 3 dimensions as opposed to 2. If we were to turn this whole room into zero gravity, you'd find all of a sudden become much more spacious, mentally and physically to you. And that's the way Skylab was. It was huge.
At the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, Skylab 4 Commander Gerald Carr visits the duplicate of the spacecraft he once called home.
I'm remembering all of the meals we had around this table in the wardroom. One of the things we always did on my mission was we always ate together.
With a freezer on board, Skylab's menu was as gourmet and luxurious as space food ever got.
We had 3 types of food. We had frozen food, and that was things like ice cream, filet mignon, lobster Newburg, roast pork and dressing. The second type of food was freeze-dried, and that's kind of what you get in a sporting goods store, camping food. The third type of food we had was canned food. NASA had a fancy term, they call it thermal stabilized, but it was just plain old canned food. And most of that was our fruits. The bathroom is over there. You can see that the toilet, the engineer who designed that was a masochist because to sit on the toilet you have to hang on the wall like a bat. They even provided us, as you could see, with seat belts to hold us on.
As well as being at the mercy of masochistic spacecraft engineers, the Skylab crews were also medical pioneers and guinea pigs. Doctors on the ground kept a close eye on how weightlessness affected their health. Body fluids were the first to change.
When the human goes into a weightless environment, the most common thing is what we call the fluid shift.
You look in the mirror and this pumpkin looks back, this round red head with bright red eyeballs. Because no longer checked by gravity, your arteries and your veins and your heart continue to force the blood up towards your head.
Luckily, bodily fluids resettle after a few days. But with idle limbs, muscle tone rapidly deteriorates.
You don't really work like you do down here. You tend to lose muscle mass, especially in your legs, and more importantly, because your heart doesn't work as hard, the size of the heart itself decreases.
Rudimentary exercise equipment helped maintain some muscle. But the first Skylab crews still lost 20% of their muscle mass in a few short weeks. So NASA ordered the crew to hit the gym for an hour and a half every day.
This is the exercise bicycle here. We took the seat off of it because the seat was a bother. We put a few towels up here, and you could stand up and bicycle with your head on the pad, and that way you could stretch your whole skeleton rather than just the lower part of your body.
I personally really enjoyed it because I missed exercise, but also it tended to pull the fluids from the upper part of your body down into your legs, and your head felt clear again.
In addition to exercise, Mission Control schedules every moment of astronauts' lives in space, which has a huge impact on crew morale, something made crystal clear on Skylab 4.
One of the major features that you want for long-duration spaceflight is, number one, some work to do which is interesting and intellectually challenging. And the second thing you want is not to have to march by the numbers.
Skylab's agenda was scheduled as rigidly and relentlessly as if they were on a one-day Mercury trip, not a 3-month-long mission. The crew had a dizzying array of medical and astronomical experiments, plus several spacewalks to accomplish.
We were overscheduled. When you're having to rush from one thing to another, you start making mistakes. And we started making mistakes from the beginning of the mission.
If you ever tried to figure out what you were going to do tomorrow and put out a list down to every 5 minutes and then try to work that way tomorrow, you'd find it'd be awful hard.
We were just being pushed too fast to do things. That caused a psychological problem for us. We didn't like failing.
I think the crew felt they probably did have a very heavy workload. We were sitting in chairs in mission control, so it was hard to feel what they were feeling up there.
A month in, the media was getting wind of the fact that the crew was less than happy.
There have been reports off and on about this crew being somewhat less enthusiastic than previous Skylab crews. Could you comment on this, please, sir?
Yeah, they're your reports, not ours. This crew is very enthusiastic. We have no problem with them.
But that enthusiasm soon waned, and eventually the issue of workload came to a head in what has famously been referred to as the first mutiny in space.
I told the people, we're going to take our Sunday off. And we really took it off. In fact, on one occasion, as we were going over a station, we had forgotten to reconfigure our radios. The people on the ground called us.
Skylab, this is Houston through Corpus Christi, Merritt Island, and Bermuda for 14.5 minutes, over.
And we didn't answer. So they had to send up an emergency pulse signal to hit an alarm and get us to pay attention and get with them again.
Okay, thank you, Skylab 4.
Okay, Bruce. So long.
They called it a striking space. I mean, strike, where were we going to go?
Something had to give.
Finally, on about day 40 or so, as we came across a U.S. pass for about 14 minutes, we told the ground what we didn't like.
I think that a crew or any man who is working long hours needs some period of time at the end of the day where he can be quiet and wind down and relax, gather your thoughts in order to kind of get yourself ready for the next day's activity.
So on the next pass, they had their turn to tell us what we were doing to make their life miserable.
We worked with the ground and came up with a better way to go at it, and I think we all were much better for it, not just ourselves in that flight, but subsequent flights to space station and so forth.
Work scheduling on space stations is now much more flexible, a change that has had a hugely positive impact on both crew morale and productivity.
It really loosened up the day, and we were far more productive. It's interesting that got picked up in a lot of management reviews, Harvard management reviews, and people used this event as an example of why you should not overschedule your employees.
On February 8, 1974, Carr, Gibson, and Pogue returned home after 84 days, 1 hour, and 16 minutes in space orbit.
It was said by some that we were probably in better shape when we got back than when we left.
Skylab was an amazing program in a lot of ways. From there, we learned how to exercise in space, how to feed people in space, just the basics of living in space for long periods of time. Skylab was really a landmark program for us.
April 14, 1970, rookie astronauts Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert and Commander Jim Lovell, a veteran of 3 NASA missions, are 2 days into the 3rd moon landing attempt on Apollo 13. 200,000 miles from Earth As the crew prepares for a night of sleep, Houston has one final routine request for the astronauts.
We have a 5-page pre-sleep checklist. We got down to the final item. Do we require a cryostir?
A cryostir turns on fans to make the oxygen tanks uniform so Mission Control can measure them.
Jack Swigert initiated this cryostir.
This loud bang occurred. I could hear and saw some warping of the metal in the tunnel.
The lights started to flash and jets started to fire, and I looked up at Fred to see if he knew what was causing all this commotion, and I could tell he didn't know.
Warning lights indicate something is wrong with the electrical system. Then more lights. 2 out of the 3 fuel cells have just died.
We've had a problem here.
Can say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Mission Control get busy trying to resolve what they think is a minor computer problem. Until Jim Lovell calls down again.
See, and it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space.
There was a sea of debris around us. Some was just shiny things out a little ways from the spacecraft. Close in, some things looked like little kernels of popcorn.
What the astronauts saw was frozen oxygen spilling out of their own air supply.
At that moment, everybody recognized that this was survival, and we started moving in an entirely different fashion.
Mission Control has been handed the job of their lives. Without inventive solutions, the crew will perish.
Let's solve the problem, but let's not make it any worse by guessing.
Their crisis is immediate. In the command module, both oxygen and power are dwindling fast.
Okay, let's make sure that we don't do anything that will cause us to lose fuel cell number 2.
The astronauts' only hope is to move into the lunar landing module, which has air and power of its own, and use it as a lifeboat to ferry them back to Earth.
Lunar module was never designed for that. It was only designed to last 45 hours, and we were at least 90 hours from home.
Now Mission Control must decide how to get them home.
The immediate reaction in the control center was to turn around and come back home. And that was understandable. But in the end, it became clear that we just didn't have enough energy to turn the vehicle around.
Mission Control picks the alternative: fly around the moon and use its gravity to slingshot the crew back to Earth. 77 hours into the mission, Apollo 13 circles around the far side of the moon and vanishes, out of contact with Earth for 45 minutes. The world is riveted.
Around the world, people suddenly became very much involved with this story. Even the Soviet Union, with whom we were racing so much and we were still enemies, they offered their help in any way they could.
On the stricken spacecraft, energy is in short supply. So all superfluous life support systems are shut off. But even with everything powered down, the air supply will not hold out long enough. The 3 astronauts are exhaling deadly CO2 into the tiny lunar module.
The lunar module canisters were limited because they were built to scrub the oxygen for 2 people for 2 days. So now we had 3 people for 5 days.
The amount of pressure of carbon dioxide was building up in the lunar module.
Spare canisters in the command module could save the crew. But these spares are square, and the lunar module carbon scrubber is round. Mission Control needs to figure something out.
So engineering comes up with the idea to fabricate an adapter to fit the square scrubber into the round hole, test it in the laboratories, and voice the instructions up to the crew.
And they used duct tape, a piece of cardboard, and a piece of plastic, and an old sock.
Literally within minutes, the crew could see the carbon dioxide pressure starting to drop.
Quick thinking at Mission Control has forestalled disaster. But another life-threatening ordeal lies ahead, the punishing heat of re-entry.
Our only concern was, did that explosion crack the heat shield of the command module someplace in the back?
During re-entry, the command module would be exposed to temperatures as hot as the surface of the sun.
If there was a crack, the heat would go right through there and of course, toast everything inside. No way we could survive.
Re-entry ionizes the gas around any spacecraft, making all radio contact impossible for 3 minutes.
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over.
My spacecraft communicator calls Odyssey Houston, standing by. And there's no response. And we call again, and we call again.
It's been 4 minutes with no reply.
That was a sinking feeling time.
All the controllers are standing, staring at those clocks, and they're wondering what went wrong.
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over. Okay, go. Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
The emotional release at that time is so intense that literally every controller is standing crying, and you're frankly embarrassed by your loss of composure.
We hit the water, and the water splashed over the windows, and we didn't continue to sink into the ocean. Then I knew we were safely on board.
When they splashed down, we just erupted with cheers, and the cigars came out, and we started waving our flags, and people were very, very thankful.
The harrowing ordeal of Apollo 13 was a stark reminder that we had not tamed space.
Apollo 13 showed that just the failure of one little wire could cause such a potential tragedy.
Ultimately, it was the highly skilled teamwork of Mission Control that saved the day.
You really do need people on the ground to manage human beings in space. The astronauts, as well-trained as they were and as expert they were in flying, really could not get their hands around the problem.
The advantage of Apollo was it's close. You know, hello, Houston. You got a 1.5 seconds delay, and then Houston responds immediately. If you're out at Mars and you had a similar problem, you're on your own.
On a trip to Mars, astronauts would face an invisible but fatal threat: deep space radiation. Solar flares and radiation belts fling high-energy protons through space. To humans, it's a deadly cocktail.
A short burst of radiation gives you radiation sickness, pretty much like you would see in the bomb blast over in Japan. The long term, even a gradual amount of radiation can cause cancer. So we've got to find radiation protection.
Radiation is not a big threat to astronauts circling in orbit.
Earth's magnetic field shields us from a lot of that because it's very thick and it's fairly powerful enough that it bends it away from us. And once you get out of that magnetic field, you are exposed to that shooting gallery, and so you're getting irradiated.
During a journey to Mars and back, astronauts could be hit with 6 times a person's normal lifetime radiation exposure. But there are some solutions, such as timing a mission to coincide with low solar activity.
Cosmic rays are a steady background radiation since they're produced by all the stars in our galaxy. But there is a modulation by our sun that occurs. So if we can plan mission at solar minimum, we can reduce the exposures maybe as much as 2 times.
Astronauts could take drugs to minimize the effect.
The second thing we can do is to look at biological countermeasures that improve a person's ability to repair DNA damage.
The spacecraft could even be encased in a protective shield of water or liquid hydrogen.
We know how to do that, but the problem with it is it's very heavy, and flight is all about reducing the weight. So how do we do it in a lightweight manner that's sustainable over a long period of time? It's a challenge.
Liftoff. We have liftoff at 9:34 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time.
It's been 40 years since NASA sized up what to pack for an extended trip. To this day, Apollo missions 15, 16, and 17, the so-called J missions, provide us with the last and only example of what living on another celestial body is like. The crew stayed on the moon's surface for 2 to 3 days at a time in order to collect geological data.
J series of missions was absolutely a blast to work on. There wasn't a second during the time we got in the vicinity of the moon that we weren't accomplishing something useful.
Years of intensive training attempted to turn the former test pilots into highly competent geologists.
When I got to NASA, I said, well, that's a piece of dirt and that's a rock. It's about my knowledge of geology. But by the time we flew on Apollo 16, we had 6 years of geology training, and we'd gotten pretty good at what I call field geology.
The crews had a packed agenda of samples to gather.
We had divided our 72 hours up into 3 24-hour periods. So it was like going to work at home. You got hungry outside because you were outside 8 hours, so we had a little candy bar that came up inside the helmet that we could nibble on. Then we got back inside, took off the spacesuit, ate a meal, and put our hammocks back up and went to sleep.
The J mission astronauts were exploring rough, uneven terrain. So their spacesuits had to be robust to protect them from the hazards of this alien landscape, but flexible enough to allow them to get on with their job.
This is David Scott's spacesuit that he wore on his Apollo 15 mission. The suit is very, very dirty, and it's good dirt. It's lunar dirt. That is really what this suit was meant to work for, to allow the astronaut to really get down into the lunar dirt and also to move around with greater ease and more flexibility.
Apollo spacesuits weighed a hefty 180 pounds, but the moon's 1/6 gravity helped them feel more like 30 pounds.
When you look at films of the Apollo astronauts walking on the surface of the moon, they're doing that sort of bunny hop. And it seems as though they're taking tiny little steps, but that's what they had to do to control that mass from moving forward. You don't want to get that suit out of your control.
It was easy to lose your balance on the moon because the backpack life support system weighed more than I did. But I found the suit's very comfortable on the lunar surface.
Unlike the moon, which is essentially a large rock in space, Mars has its own atmosphere and seasons.
Mars has dust storms on a periodic basis. It has a change of seasons, so a Martian suit will have to be very rigorous.
A small step on Martian soil will require a giant leap in spacesuit design. Back at the Johnson Space Center, the Spacesuit Lab is creating a suit fit for 21st century astronauts.
We really need to make these suits as usable for the crew members as we can possibly do, because we've asked them to do a very difficult job in a very difficult environment.
In 2012, NASA announced the first new spacesuit design in 20 years. Every inch is geared to make surface exploration easier.
This is a planetary spacesuit prototype. We call it the Z1 suit. It has a lot of mobility built into the lower torso. So it has a bearing here at the hip. It has another bearing here at the thigh. And then it also has a bearing down here at the ankle. You can see the boots are very different. They're much more like working boots or hiking boots. So it allows you to get in the boot. You have an adjustment to get your foot fitted to the boot better. And then it allows you to have a good walking sole for walking over rough terrain.
And a new helmet will enhance the view.
This, hopefully, with the angle and then the bubble, the hemispherical bubble, allows you better downward visibility. And that's, you can see here, this Velcro is where we're trying to figure out where we want to put controls on the suit. But we're trying to still keep this as clean as we can keep it so you can see down.
The right suit is essential to get the most out of your time on another planet. So is having the right set of wheels.
We were very, very fortunate when somebody had the idea for the lunar rover, because it really revolutionized lunar exploration.
The lunar rover was a two-seat roadster with a top speed of 11 miles per hour. Cleverly stowed away and ferried to the moon on the lunar lander.
To watch the way they fold that thing up and tuck it away in one of the bays in the lunar module would warm the cockles of the hearts of many, many mechanical engineers.
It was a great vehicle. Each wheel had its own electric motor, so it was four-wheel drive. The tires were sort of weird because they were wire. And I first saw that, and I said, God, wire tires, that doesn't look right. But they just filled up with dust, and it gave it tremendous traction, so it would go up a 25-degree slope.
Man, we are really going up a hill, I'll tell you.
Charlie Duke and his crewmate Sean Young spent 3 days driving around the moon on Apollo 16.
This is going to be a good day, Charlie.
First off, John wouldn't let me drive. I was the navigator. So I've got the maps, and I've got to get us from point A to point B, which might be 2 miles away. But we had some good times filming what we call the Grand Prix. I got off with a movie camera, and I said, come on, John, give me a sharp turn. He said, I don't want to do a Sharpie. I said, come on, John, give me a Sharpie. He said, okay, here's a Sharpie.
Man, you are really bouncing.
Duke and Young drove the rover 17 miles, collecting 213 pounds of lunar highland rocks.
The lunar rover allowed the crew to extend the range beyond that which they could walk in their spacesuits. I would say it's sort of like in the explorers in the United States when they move from walking on land, all of a sudden they find a river and they now got a canoe. So basically you expand the ability to survey what's going on.
With 1.5 years to explore Mars, astronauts will need a new rover to travel farther and keep them alive for longer. At Johnson Space Center, Bill Bluthman shows off the rover of the future.
All right, so let's take a look at the space exploration vehicle.
The biggest change is that the crew will trek in the safety of a pressurized cocoon.
Inside this cabin, you'd explore in your shirt sleeves. We thought if we took the crew, put them inside a pressurized area where they could explore, 1 day at a time, 3 days, 14 days, you could really see the surface better.
The second new design feature is its ability to move in any direction.
It has infinite steering, so these can spin effectively forever. We sometimes call it omni-drive or crab drive.
The ability to drive sideways allows the rover to dock with the habitation pod and other rovers. But the most distinctive element of the new rover is found at its rear.
So on the backside here, we have really a new concept, which is what we call a suit port.
The suit port means the suits never come into the rover. Instead, astronauts will climb into them from inside, seal the backpack on, and then detach from the rover. A design feature directly inspired by the Apollo missions, where contamination from the surface was a real issue.
The dust of the moon is so fine, it gets in your suit, it got in your boots, gets on your hands, and you can't brush it off. So all of that tracks back inside with you, and it was just everywhere.
Dust can get into the lungs and corrupt instruments, but with suit ports, this will no longer be a problem. Not only that, but these new suits will remain pressurized, saving hours of prep time with the traditional suits.
If you're exploring on a surface and you saw something you might not have expected, if it took you 46 hours to get out and put your hands on it, do a sample of it, that might not be the best approach. Whereas if you get in and out in 15 minutes, you really can get back on your exploration path.
All of that exploration is bound to work up an appetite. Feeding astronauts on Mars is an entirely new challenge for NASA's food lab.
When the missions were short, the crew members, really the importance of food was way at the, way down the list as far as they were concerned. They considered it a camping trip. It was, I can find something I like, no big deal. But then early in station, we ran into some situations where food supplies ran low or coffee supplies ran low on orbit. And it became very obvious that this was a big deal for the crew members.
We all enjoy our time around the galley table. I believe I hold the record for daily calorie intake. I was over 5,000 calories a day for the first several weeks I was up there. When you're exercising hard, you sort of want more food.
But it cost $50,000 in fuel to lift the weight of a small bottle of water into space. And each astronaut would require more than 4,000 pounds of food over a 3-year trip to Mars. That's a $320 million restaurant tab per person. So it won't be practical to carry all their nutrition with them. Instead, they'll have a high-tech interior kitchen garden for growing their own food.
Once we're on the surface of Mars, we're going to be using what we call a bioregenerative food system. So this food system would include growing vegetables, fruits, and maybe other baseline crops.
Astronauts on the ISS have experimented with space gardening for years.
Plants give off oxygen and use carbon dioxide. So it's a wonderful way to recycle the air system.
So the Mars crew will have a bountiful garden, a comfortable habitation pod, and wheels to explore. What seemed like the stuff of science fiction just 50 years ago slowly seems more possible. And while engineers refine their prototypes, rocket scientists are focusing on the single thing that could revolutionize everything in one fell swoop: new propulsion methods.
Advanced propulsion, getting to Mars within a few weeks instead of a few months, may be the answer. We'll lose less bone, less muscle, and most importantly, less radiation effects. So nobody goes on a sea voyage for 3 years anymore. You know, our ships are faster, we have other ways to do it, and that's what we need. That's the quantum leap we need in space exploration.
No matter how long the trip to Mars takes and all the challenges to overcome, there is no shortage of current astronauts eager to be selected.
It would be an incredible adventure. We will learn so many things along the way. It's a very important trip. It'd take a long time. I'd miss my family. I'd be fried by radiation, but I'd still take that trip.
Going to Mars is a huge leap of discovery, and I don't know very many people who wouldn't sign up to go.
The next generation might be the first to send humans millions of miles away. Just 60 years ago, we were barely getting off the ground.
We did not understand rocketry. I'd say 50% of the rockets that were flying at that time failed.
But we persevered all the way to the moon. Since then, we've honed our skills in countless orbits around the Earth in ever more advanced spacecraft. And our probes, rovers, and telescopes are glimpsing farther and farther, offering tantalizing targets of exploration.
My favorite thing about Curiosity is all of the fantastic cameras. Those super zoomed in images paint a picture of Mars that makes me want to go there.
Humans have been exploring the Earth for a few 100,000 years and exploring space for only 60. We're barely out of the gate, but we are gaining speed.
It takes like 4 years just to reach our nearest star. So when it comes to real space travel, we have barely nudged the tip of our toe out the front door. But we also understand we're on the front end of something much larger than any of us can imagine.